Not All Diamonds and Rosé. By the way, look at how big this book is. It's quite thick. It's 450 pages. And I read this all in one weekend, which tells you it's an easy, quick read, what they call a trashy read. Here's the thing, I've done gay book reviews in the past. I did one on this channel about running with scissors. I think I did one on the Velvet Rage. Might have done another one or two. I want to include this book in that mix. Now you're probably thinking, is it really a gay book review? It's about the Real Housewives. Yes, I know what you mean. However, I do kind of think of it as like a Venn diagram. Like, you know, there's one circle, there's one region that's like Real Housewives, one that's like gay culture, and they meet somewhere halfway in between. I associate both with like campy, frivolous culture, mindless entertainment, creative people behind the scenes, crazy antics in the forefront. Also, not to mention the author of this book, Dave Quinn, is a gay man. They interview several gay people throughout the book who were involved in the show somehow. Of course, there's Andy Cohen, for anybody who's familiar with him. He's famously one of the head honchos at Bravo, the network that runs the Housewives series. So I'm including this as a gay book review. Also, the Real Housewives is like the gayest thing about me. The fact that I watch the Real Housewives is like the most stereotypical gay thing I think about me. And they're not all the same. Like, I've seen one episode of at least every Real Housewives show. I don't know if you guys can hear that. They're doing yard work outside. I'm sorry, landscaping. I used to add music to my videos and I've just stopped. I've given up. It's just too much work. Okay, it's getting louder, isn't it? Anyway, so I've seen an episode of every Real Housewives. I'm gonna put this book down. I've seen an episode of every Real Housewives city, but some have captivated me more than others, and I think that's the general. Actually, they talk about this in the book, how for whatever reason there's a fan base that always gravitates towards the New York City Housewives. There's one that gravitates towards the Beverly Hills Housewives, the Atlanta Housewives, and so on. And it really is true. For me, the East Coast Housewives have always been more riveting, like the New York City Housewives, the New Jersey Housewives show. There's just something about those that feel more authentic to me, and maybe it's relatable because I've lived most of my life on the East Coast, but there's just something about the West Coast Housewives that feels more surface and therefore less like authentic and relatable. I am familiar though with all of the different cities and all the different casts because I've seen at least like an episode or so of every city, and then some of the shows I've watched more heavily. So this is one of those books where if you have that context, it'll be entertaining because you're gonna like see more layers to things that you've probably wondered from watching the show. But if you have no idea or no interest, you would never want to read this book. Like, it's not a super like a sociological take or like a psychological take on this pop culture phenomenon. It's really more like extending that mindless sort of silly gossip and just mindless entertainment about this, at this point, like historic TV show in terms of ratings and how much press it's gotten and how many like spin-off sort of businesses and other shows it has led to. So the way the book is framed, it really goes through every city where they've had Real Housewives, even DC, where they only had one season that was famously like cut out of the narrative of Housewives history because that was the show that had the White House crashers, if you guys remember that, who had crashed, like, was it a congressional dinner or something with Barack Obama? And obviously Bravo didn't want that press. They didn't want to go near it because it was like a homeland security issue. So that show got cut out, but even that's included in the book. And every city has their own section, and it starts like historically from the beginning, how that show started, how the castmates got introduced, and then like every new person that joined, how they were involved. So it's cool in that way that it's like a timeline and each city gets its own sort of dedicated section. And what's also neat is that you hear from current housewives of that show, previous housewives, and also production. So people that you otherwise like don't see at the forefront giving their take on things, they are giving that outside, behind the scenes, like breaking the fourth wall perspective on things. But the way it's written is actually kind of the way the show works, in that the author doesn't ever narrate anything. I mean, here and there he gives a few lines to give context to set up the news section, but otherwise it's really just production and the housewives setting the scene and saying like, this is how it started. I got approached to do a show, blah, 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 blah. And then it's just back and forth, like interview style, kind of like when you read a transcript, like an interview that you read in a magazine. The book is written that way. It feels almost like an episode of The Real Housewives, or even like a reunion episode, but it's like a mega reunion episode because everybody's included. He had to interview at least like 100 housewives. There's at least like 100 housewives, you know, cast members, previous and current, who give their take, which I find very impressive. And at the same time, I'm also like, wow, so many of these women really must feel like they still have a lot to say. And you hear it in the tone, like some of them sound so bitter that you're like, wow, they will do anything. They will speak to anybody to have a platform. But of course, this is one of those things where like, I'm sure every new housewife he interviewed, Dave Quinn, the author, I'm sure every new housewife, he would tell them, well, I've already interviewed this person, that, and she said this about you. So you definitely want to insert your opinion. So it's like a domino effect, right? The more women get involved, the more other women want to be involved to share their piece. And what's interesting is, of course, there's a few like very famous housewives, like Bethany Frankel, most notably also Gretchen from Orange County, who are not in this book. They refuse, and they have said on social media, like, why would I give this information for free? Like, what do I get out of it? Which to me makes them smart businesswomen. But of course, then what happens is you have all these other women talking about them and production, sharing an opinion, and it wasn't always favorable, especially for those two that I just mentioned. But it is really interesting to me as a phenomenon how, like, there's no way the 100+ women in this got paid for this. So they basically, for free, gave their time to do interviews that are forever cemented in this book. And a lot of it is just like trash talking and gossip. I don't know. I find that very interesting, especially somebody like Carol Radziwill. I always feel like I'm saying that. Am I saying that last name right? Carol from The Real Housewives of New York. She's one of the most like notable people who's been on the show. Like, she had a huge career as a journalist. She has a New York Times bestseller. This is all before the show. She had a very like credible, successful career that wasn't anything related to reality TV. She had married into the Kennedy family. So it's so weird to me to see someone of that legacy, I guess, be in this book again for free, talking shit about all these other women. And by the way, out of all the women he talked to, I feel like she probably sounded the most bitter, like the most resentful at everything. Production, Andy Cohen, some of the other women. And you're like, wow, like, for what? Like, why are you risking this, you know? But again, it's this phenomenon that they cast these women who are so, I guess maybe they feel so unheard in life that this is like their platform, and any chance they get to defend themselves, they want to do that. But I just find it fascinating. So overall, I found the book really entertaining. It is really interesting to hear about like the formation story behind each city, and how most of the shows, originally there was a different plan. Like, they didn't want to repeat The Real Housewives of Orange County. They wanted a different thing. They wanted Manhattan Moms for the New York City ones. They wanted the Dallas Housewives for that to focus on the charity world of Dallas, because, you know, Dallas is like very much old money, and they wanted it to look like Dynasty, the show Dynasty. Same thing with Atlanta. It was supposed to be called like Ladies of Hotlanta. So there's all these origin stories, but consistently there's the same theme of, oh, we should just make this a housewives show. So you see from the production, I think for me the most interesting part of the book was actually listening to production share their perspective, because they're not as biased, right? Like they're more professional, and their career's at stake. It's not just like, oh, reality TV made me look bad. So to me, they had more credibility in sharing all of this. But I thought it was interesting how so often they wanted to deviate and separate themselves from the Housewives franchise, for whatever reason. And I think maybe part of it was just stigma, that they knew some women wouldn't want to be associated with a show that's historically been known for like cat fights. But consistently it went back to, if it isn't broken, why fix it, right? Like, this is a successful template. Let's just repeat this in Atlanta, in New York City, in Dallas, wherever. There were some like bombs dropped of crazy stories that you're like, ugh, like just in the manipulative character of some of the women. Also just stuff that like you would have never really known until now, like how the whole cast really felt and production felt when one of the Real Housewives' husbands committed suicide, or like revelations of alcoholism or drug addiction. But the thing is, I kind of already knew a lot of the buzz in this just from the hype the book has gotten on social media, a lot of like gems were kind of dropped. And I think that was done on purpose, probably to promote the book. But what happened is that I read it and I kind of already knew all the crazy stuff that had been mentioned because I had just seen it on social media. Another thing that I was thrown off by was all the grammar mistakes, like the poor editing of the book. There was one section where it's Candy Burris talking from The Real Housewives of Atlanta, and then pages later, I was like, wait, I feel like I just read these exact words from her, and I flipped back, and it was the exact same paragraph. The exact same paragraph in this book was repeated 2 pages later accidentally, or like just silly spelling mistakes. And I was like, you know, when a book doesn't feel professional, then you just start to question the credibility of anything in it. But I was kind of shocked by that like this was such an in-depth work with so many people interviewed, at least 100 people, as I said. And then to have those like silly mistakes, like repeating a paragraph, like that's bizarre to me. It also feels to me like the later sections, because it is chronological. So they start with the Orange County Housewives, then New York City, Atlanta, and so on. But you do feel like as it keeps going, there's less attention devoted to each series. Like the Orange County section is the biggest one, and it kind of makes sense because it's the longest running one, right? So there's the most seasons, you could argue the most to talk about, right? Because a little bit is talked about from every season versus, let's say, The Real Housewives of Dallas, which at the time of this book I think had only had like 4 seasons or so. So of course that's going to affect length, but it does feel to me like it gets sloppy as it keeps going, like less attention is devoted, whereas a lot of the minutia in the Orange County Housewives is discussed. But the biggest issue for me is when you create a book like this that is rehashing all the gossip, it's always going to feel ephemeral, right? Because this book in like 3 years is going to feel completely outdated. I mean, even finishing this book a few days ago, I was like, wow, what about the last season of New York City? What about the last season of, Potomac or whatever? When you make a book sound so present, like the gossip is so up to date, then of course you're going to be at a disadvantage like 3 years later when it all feels outdated and none of the new information has been added. And that's just the nature of, having a book like this, of course. But there is stuff that I was shocked was left out, but I'm like, oh, they must have finished writing this like a year ago before the current seasons finished or even started, which automatically makes the book feel outdated. I mean, it doesn't even mention the Erica Girardi and Tom Girardi lawsuit, which is like one of the biggest things that's ever rocked the TV show. Of course, I know with books, it's like, they finish the book and then they have to get clearance and then there's marketing and then it gets, actually printed. Like it's a whole timeline. So they must have just finished this like a year or so ago, which of course just, like I said, automatically makes things feel not up to speed. The only way to really avoid that is to have a book that focuses more so on the history, like trapped in a certain time frame. Like if they had just done the origin story of each show and just kept it at, this is like what the first year of the show was like, and this is how the show has evolved over the years, I think it could have kept the book from ever feeling too outdated. But because so much of it leaves off like right at the very last season of every show, inherently that makes this book not so significant even just a few years from now. Other than that, it was an entertaining read for anybody who's a fan of the Housewives and wants more intel, especially into, like I said, the origin story, how these things come together and how nobody really knows how it's going to turn out. Not the cast, not even production. They just kind of hope for the best and experiment along the way, and they make mistakes and then they realize like, oh, it's really more interesting when the show revolves around the relationships of the women together as opposed to their individual like family lives or professional lives if they have one. And again, there is like a humorous part to hearing like the digs of the women who are still kind of bitter, and hearing them say something kind of scandalous, and then the next person, again, it's like a reunion episode of the Housewives, but it like printed as a book. And then, the next person will say, that's absolutely not true. Here's what really happened. And then production, there's a line from somebody from production that's like, neither of those stories are true. What really happened is da 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 da. So it is fun in like a, like superficial kind of fun, silly read. But this isn't one of those books that like you're gonna reread. Like this is not at all like the other two books that I've done gay book reviews for, where you can reread it and you think about it, you know, for days and reflect on it. But that's not what this is intended for anyway. And I'm aware of it. I think even the people involved in the Real Housewives are aware of the fact that this is like a moment in time of pop culture and entertainment. And more I've been hearing from people. I know a guy who runs a podcast where he mostly interviews Real Housewives. He also interviews other reality stars, but that's like what he's known for. And he was telling me that he feels like time's up on the Housewives, that like there's only so much more innovation they can do with this show. And, you know, audiences are fickle, right? They get into something and then they lose interest, and then, you know, sometimes they try to revive shows and it usually doesn't really work. And also there's been a shift, I think, in culture in general, where especially with Gen Z, I feel like there's a move away from like mean-spirited behavior. And I think reality TV has totally paralleled that. I think the competition shows are a great example of this. Like American Idol used to be, up until the last episodes of The Great Singers, it was like making fun of these horrible singers. And now those shows are so much more about like, we're supportive, like we're rooting for you. And I think with Housewives, there was a period where it got very dark and very toxic, like how mean the women were to each other. And Bravo capitalized off of that, and you know, millions of people tuned in. And I think now people are just kind of over it. And I think COVID has had an effect on this too. I think COVID has been a part of it, that people just want like lighthearted, easy, positive entertainment, fun hobbies. Like people don't want anything too deep or too controversial or too, like I said, toxic. And so the Housewives are having to deal with that and figure out how to pivot in a way that's entertaining but not boring. I made a video about this recently, that they're now doing a new show in Dubai, The Real Housewives, and I think this is the new direction, like not just coming up with totally new cities, but trying to find like totally different pockets of culture that they haven't really tapped into. I mean, the last one before that was The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, and that one has been getting great ratings and great viewership because, again, they're tapping into this weird niche subculture of Mormonism and, you know, this place where religion is so important. By the way, Salt Lake City isn't mentioned in this at all, again, because just timing-wise, it was too late, I guess, to fit it in, but it's proving to be now one of the more talked about shows of the franchise. So it goes with my, you know, mentality again, that this book is already feeling kind of outdated. So anyway, I'm very curious to see how Bravo reinvents the Real Housewives franchise and tries to keep it fresh, or maybe at some point decides to end it and go in another direction. In general, they have found tremendous success with all-female cast, even beyond the Real Housewives shows. There's Married to Medicine. They had a show called Ladies of London. So it'll be very interesting to see how they try to keep this going, because it has proven lucrative. But you always, with TV, with anything, with any entertainment, anything really, any product, you always have to keep it modern and relevant and like cutting edge. So this book, I do recommend it to anybody who's a fan of the show, who's interested in like the nuances and the history and the behind the scenes. Beyond that, again, for anybody who's not familiar with the specific cast of characters, so to speak, you wouldn't find it that enthralling. Have any of you guys read this?